So we're looking at what happened to the church after the conclusion of Acts and the ministry of the apostles there and the establishment of it in the localized area from Jerusalem and on up clear into Rome. And this is called the age of Catholic Christianity, Catholic being a term of universality. We've looked at this statement from Bruce Shelley, and I'll be using his work a lot today in our class. But he says in this period, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and probably east into India. Christians realized that they were part of a rapidly expanding movement, and they called it Catholic. This suggested that it was universal in spite of pagan ridicule and Roman persecution, and it was the true faith in opposition to all perversions of Jesus' teachings. And we'll get back to that true faith based on the scriptures more next week. To face the challenges of their time, Shelley says, Christians turned increasingly to their bishops for spiritual leadership. And we'll come back to that concept of moving to like a one-person-led churches. And then Catholic Christianity, therefore, was marked by a universal vision, by orthodox beliefs, and by Episcopal church government. And we will come back to the whole thing of Episcopal church government as well. And we had noted that the reasons for this geographical expansion were just the burning conviction that early Christians had that they knew the truth, they knew the one true God, and they were committed to that. That the gospel met a widely felt need in the hearts of people. These are pagan lands, somewhat Judaized by the Jews who were spread throughout the kingdom, but still in a very real spiritual darkness and a spiritual need. That the practical expression of Christian love was probably among the most powerful causes of Christian success, and that persecution in many instances helped to publicize the Christian faith. And that's what we're going to look at today, is this whole idea of persecution, where it came from, why it happened, and how that explains or how that helps to understand these first few centuries in the church. We noted that the church leaders were concerned with three main things: unity, truth, and authority. And we've talked a little bit already about unity and truth. We're going to come back next week and further explore the ideas of truth and authority through the scriptures. But from an external standpoint, they had to deal with persecution. And so we want to focus on that today. And to remember that, as we saw in the book of Acts, Satan, in his overall desire, is to replace God's kingdom with his own on earth and probably in the heavens as well. And short of that, if he can't do that, to at least destroy God's kingdom. That's just the nature of this malignant being. And so his strategy is to try to destroy members of God's kingdom, whether it be Israel in the Old Testament period, or in the New Testament period, the Church of Christ, or to pervert the witness of God's kingdom with apostasy in belief or practice. Today we're going to look at the strategy of trying to destroy it through physical persecution. And next week we will look more at the whole idea of apostasy and belief and how important that was and how the early church resisted those kinds of compromising effects. And so today we're going to look at the idea of persecution and martyrdom. And again, the term martyrdom, it's like the word baptism. Baptism isn't a translation, it's a transliteration of the Greek word baptizo, which means to dip or to plunge into something. And so it's a transliteration which people fill in with various meaning. The word martyr is the same thing. We've seen this in the book of Acts, but it's never translated martyr. How is it translated? Anybody remember? Witness. You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Samaria and Judea and to the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, the word witness has nothing to do with death in and of itself, unless you're witnessing to something that brings the penalty of death. And so that's where the word martyr comes from. They were testifying. When they testified, when they witnessed to the fact that they were Christians, And the other aspect of this word witness would be to confess. I'm confessing Christ. I'm naming Christ. I'm confessing that I belong to Christ. That in and of itself has nothing to do with death, unless that confession brought with it the penalty that the Roman government would extract. So that's an interesting tie of the positive function of witnessing to the negative outcome in the early church and down through church through the ages as well, of dying for that confession. So that's where the word martyr comes from, and it doesn't primarily have to do with death, but death as a result of witnessing to and confessing that they believed in Christ and they belonged to Christ. And what we'll see is in contradistinction to worshiping Caesar. So Jeff Bingham says this. He says, for the second century believer, since discipleship meant following Christ, then being his disciple may very well involve stepping into the blood-soaked footprints left by Jesus under the cross. To rebel against martyrdom, that is to retreat, would be a failure to imitate Jesus in his quiet submission to death. And these passages that are mentioned here, Isaiah 53:7 talks about he was oppressed and afflicted, but he did not open his mouth. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter. Matthew 24:13, he answered not a word to the governor that was quizzing him. And then in Mark 15:5, we see that he's, I got to get rid of that. He answered nothing to Pilate. In Luke 23, when he was questioned, he answered nothing. John 19:9, he went to the praetorium and said to Jesus, where are you from? And he gave no answer. So the idea is that Jesus was not resisting the treatment. We're really prickly when it comes to people infringing on our rights, much less saying, yeah, I'll put you to death on the basis of what comes out of your mouth next. And so basically what we're seeing here is that it was following Jesus Christ in his submission and in his willingness to go to the cross for us, and he did not resist that. And so discipleship really entails following him in the attitude as well as the action of giving himself to whatever faith in Jesus Christ would entail. And we see this 1 Peter 2:21-23, and we're going to look at 2 Peter, a passage in 2 Peter, but 1 Peter talks about this willing submission. For to this you were called, and Peter's talking about suffering unrighteously or righteously, suffering not for doing something wrong, but suffering in spite of the fact that you're doing something right. He says, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return, when he suffered he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously.
See, I always thought that we were called to health, wealth, and prosperity.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. And when that's taken away from us, we should shout and protest as loudly as possible. Well, and that's what discipleship means to a lot of people. The freedom to become what I want to become, to worship the Lord Jesus Christ and be blessed by him and protected from all harm. That was not the attitude of the early church. In fact, when they believed, they realized they were putting themselves in for just the opposite. Yeah, Bingham says this. He says, such accounts leave us stunned, perplexed, and almost incredulous. How, we demand, could a Christian be masochistic? How could a mature believer, a bishop, leader of a church, hold such a bizarre view of death? In our culture, even our Christian culture, which underscores self-fulfillment and self-preservation, such statements appear grotesque, even repulsive. This view, however, may say more about the oddity of modern Christianity and its view of what constitutes discipleship than about the eccentricity of Ignatius. And he's looking at Ignatius here. He would not embrace self-preservation at the expense of not imitating Christ. He was willing to surrender to the Father's will because he was not greater than his master. And so we see here that the statement of Ignatius when on his at his trial, which would lead to his death, and this is what Bingham is referring to. He says, "I am writing to all the churches and am insisting to everyone that I die for God of my own free will, unless you hinder me. I implore you, do not be unseasonably kind to me. Let me be food for the wild beasts. Then I will truly be a disciple of Jesus Christ when the world will no longer see my body." So we do have to be impressed with the willingness with which the early church faced and accepted the very real prospect of being put to death for their faith. We don't have an account of Ignatius' martyrdom, but we do of a man by the name of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. And he lived from AD 70 to about 155. He was the bishop of Smyrna, one of the churches of the letters to the Revelation. Do you know what's significant about that letter to Smyrna in respect to all the rest? I know. There's no condemnation. There's no criticism. It's a church that is praised. And it's interesting that it was the disciple of John himself who was the leader of that church. And this is a depiction of the martyrdom of Polycarp. And Fox's Book of Martyrs is a collection of stories about Christians through the ages who have died. And this is kind of his martyrdom was recorded, and so we have this coming down to us in various church records or writings. And he was brought into a crowded arena, prepared to shove him to the lions, but only reluctantly. Whoever was putting him to death wasn't really all that intense about it. And so if he would say that the right thing, he'd be okay. So the governor simply swear by Caesar. That's what the governor said. "I am a Christian," said Polycarp. "If you want to know what that is, set a day and listen." In other words, let me testify you like Paul did to Roman authorities. And Polycarp says, "Well, persuade the people." Polycarp said, "I would explain to you, but not to them." "Then I'll throw you to the beast." "Bring on your beasts," said Polycarp. "If you scorn the beasts, I'll have you burned." Polycarp says, "You try to frighten me with the fire that burns for an hour, and you forget the fire of hell that never goes out." The governor called to the people, "Polycarp says he is a Christian," and the mob let loose. "This is the teacher of Asia, the father of the Christians, the destroyer of our gods." So Polycarp, praying that his death would be an acceptable sacrifice, was burned at the stake. And Shelley says this, he says, "The picture of defenseless, peaceful Christians standing in their white robes before menacing lions while an amphitheater echoed the shouts of blood for a Roman throng is largely misleading." Now, it did happen that Christians were put to death, during the gladiatorial combats and so forth. But he says prior to AD 200, Roman attempts to silence Christians were half-hearted at best. Few Roman emperors were bloodthirsty villains, at least, but there were some who were. Why then did Rome persecute Christians? Why do we look back to this period as the age of martyrs? Well, that's what we want to start looking at today, and looking at with regard to, first of all, what Rome's basic policy was. Rome's policy was basically toleration of Christians with a condition and one exception. The condition was in their toleration, because they tolerated all sorts of religions. In fact, there's probably very few, if any, religions that they did not tolerate to some respect. The condition is all you had to do is add to all your other religious beliefs homage to the Roman emperor, pay homage to the Roman emperor. And we'll talk more about what that actually meant. One exception, the Jews, okay? The Jews were let off of this, and why is that? Did I say last week that somebody estimated that the Jewish population in the Roman Empire is about 7%? Does anybody recall that? So there's a significant number, but they were by no means a number large enough to demand an exception. But their exception was based on two things: fanatical loyalty to their one true God. It wasn't just, oh, I'll worship that God. No, it was one God, the God revealed in the Old Testament. Now, Israel, both the northern and southern kingdom, had gone into captivity for, among other things, idolatry, worshiping other gods, sacrificing to other gods. When they came back from the Babylonian captivity, they were broken of that. And they became committed monotheists. And when the Roman world and the Greek world took them over, they fought against them, and they fought against any allegiance to any other kind of a god. So they did have a fanatical loyalty to their one true God, but also a readiness, as Shelley says, a readiness to turn their homeland into a blood-soaked wilderness before they would acknowledge any other deity. So there was a large segment of Jews who were willing to die for their faith, and they would rebel. And so the Romans, in their wisdom, said, all right, let's not make it an issue. We'll let them live in Palestine. We'll let them worship their God. We won't make them do homage to Caesar, and we'll keep things intact. So it's interesting that that's what happened. So with regard to the exception, at first, Christians were considered just one more sect of the Jews. And that's why at the very beginning, there was no official persecution by the Romans. And of course, it's true that the early church was largely of Jews, and they shared allegiance to the Old Testament and the God of the Jews. So at first they were just considered a sect of the Jews, and that gave them a measure of protection. And the other thing was that the Jews were a sort of a closed corporation, a people set apart from others by the mark of circumcision, who lived and worshiped largely by themselves and did no active proselytizing. Now, that's not what God had intended for the nation of Israel. He had planted them in the crossroads of all the nations and the trade routes. And one of the reasons he had planted them there is that he wanted to use them to testify of who he was. And so the Jews really did have a missionary mandate. They were a kingdom of priests. Now, that didn't mean they had priests. All the kingdoms had priests in their religions. But they were a priest nation that God placed there to be a representative between himself and the rest of the nations. And we see some examples of that working. You know, we think of various individuals who came into contact with the God of Israel through the Jews. But basically, the Jews lost or never really understood that missionary mandate, and they really came to live within themselves and just view others as just lower, and they'd eventually come under God's judgment. And that's one of the reasons for the failure of Israel to believe in Christ and to see what God was doing when he did came. But the Jews made it known that Christians were not part of them. So as it went on, they purposely separated themselves. They didn't want to be known as having a sect that believed what the Christians did. And then Christians were not non-proselytizers. And that's, of course, where the rubber really hit the road. So the Jews made it known that Christians were not a part of them, and the Christians were not non-proselytizers. In fact, as Shelley says, the Christians, on the other hand, were always talking about their Jesus. They were out to make Christians of the entire population of the empire, and the rapidity of their spread showed that this was no idle dream. Not only did they, like the Jews, refuse to worship the emperor as a living God, but they were doing their utmost to convince every subject of the emperor to join them in their refusal. From time to time, then, Christians felt the wrath of the empire and its people. So the Christians were not going to live like the Jews. We'll worship our God and we'll stay to ourselves and we'll avoid persecution. That was not what they were about. They were following the mandate that God gave to the disciples, going into all the world to make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to observe whatever I've commanded you. So they took that seriously. And so this was the reason for the spread, and this becomes then the center with regard to why they were so persecuted. So reasons for persecution, and Shelley develops four, and these are the four that everybody, all the books organize their thoughts around. First of all, Christians' distinctive lifestyle. Secondly, the slanders that were disseminated about them. There were a lot of false things said that people took as true, and if they were true, well, they were a bunch that we didn't want around us, among us, and we didn't want to be a part of. They were accused of atheism. We've mentioned that a little bit before. We'll develop that. And then the tradition of emperor worship, which is what really became the main reason for their persecution. So the Christians' distinctive lifestyle. Christians were different. In fact, the word that is translated saints is from hagios, meaning distinct or different, holy. A holy thing was something that was set apart for some specific use. So we've got the implements in the temple. They were holy. They were set apart for God's use. Well, God set His people apart for His use. Set His people apart to be worshipful of Him and distinct from the rest of the people, distinct from all cultures and so forth, because they were to represent God. God is holy. He is distinct. He is one of a kind. And those who believed in Him, Old Testament and New Testament, were to evidence that distinctness. And so that's, first of all, just what the term meant and how they viewed themselves and what they were. They separated themselves from religious feasts and social parties. Now, the whole Roman Empire, with all the religions, these feasts just had to do with everything. If you were invited to participate in some social gathering, it might include a sacrifice to the gods, and so you'd be involved in that. There were trade guilds and so forth, and those were often oriented around certain gods, and part of being involved in the trade guild would be having to offer a sacrifice to that god. Sort of like if you're going to belong to the plumbers union or the electrical union, you couldn't just be a union member and do your work and pay your dues. You had to also become, whatever their club was and give some kind of allegiance to that. And then there were the occupations that you might be involved in doing with regard to actually fostering a religion, whether it's carving images because you're working for a woodworker who, that's part of his business. And so there are all kinds of things that Christians did not want to associate themselves with. In fact, Shelley mentions one interesting one. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. Anyway, he mentions school teaching. He says, Tertullian, a little later in the middle of this, he said he forbade a Christian to be a school teacher because such teaching involved using textbooks and told the ancient stories of the gods and called for observing the religious festivals of a pagan year. Does that have any kind of a familiar ring to it? That's what's going on today. So there were all kinds of things, and they weren't just being snobbish. It had to do with, does this compromise my stand as a Christian? Does this compromise my witness, my testimony? So they purposefully separated themselves, not just to be different, not to be snobbish, and it wasn't just legalism things, we don't do this or this or this or this, but it's we do this, and therefore that precludes me in being involved in that. So it all had to do with religion. It had to do with the whole thing of what was going on philosophically and religiously within the various contexts. Now that doesn't mean they couldn't be good citizens. It doesn't mean they could not hold productive jobs and be responsible in their employment. It just meant there were things that they kept themselves from that the rest of the Roman populace had no problem with. They shunned gladiatorial combats. Obviously, they had a view of human life that did not allow them to go and view it as entertainment. And they were brutal. It was often slaves who had been taken captive from other countries. You, of course, know the whole movie, not Spartacus, the Gladiator. Yeah, I mean, and it's just, it was inhumane. Well, God's created all people, and so therefore they had a respect for people, so they would not involve themselves in that. Now, we watch football and boxing and other things. I just sometimes wonder how far away it is, but at least that's willing participation. It's not people we've collected and say, go out there and knock on each other for our entertainment. We won't go there. And they avoided certain occupations when it would lead to participating with religious practices. So, in short, the early Christian was almost bound to divorce himself from the social and economic life of his time if he wanted to be true to his Lord. This meant that everywhere the Christian turned, his life and faith were on display, because the gospel introduced a revolutionary new attitude toward human life. Shelley says, this widespread hatred of Christians helps explain the first persecution from Roman hands. In the year 64, during the reign of Emperor Nero, fire broke out in Rome for 6 days and nights, and the fire burned. The greater part of the city was laid in ashes. And there was a rumor that Nero had created the fire, but he goes on to say, he says it could be that this was the time of Peter and Paul's martyrdoms in Rome. He says such outbursts of bloodshed were not common during the 1st and 2nd centuries. For long periods, Christians felt left in peace. But like the sword of Damocles, persecution was always poised just above them. So we see that there were background reasons. And then the final thing, they were positively distinct in their views on slavery, children, and sex. Now, it doesn't mean that Christians didn't have slaves. We actually see that in the book of Philemon. But they were to treat their slaves as brothers, not as chattel, not as just animals. And so the issue is not slavery per se, but your view of human life. And children, it was common to, somebody had a daughter and you didn't want any more daughters, you just wanted sons, you just leave them exposed. And so they're just treated more like animals. And sex, the same thing. Just the debaucheries and so forth in the religious practices, as well as just the whole culture. So it wouldn't be hard to stand out as being different in the Roman Empire if you held to the biblical ethic and to a biblical view of the sanctity of human life, the dignity of people, and the one true God. So they were distinctive in their lifestyle, and that was one of the reasons that led to persecution in various places, in varied ways, but it did get more and more severe. And then there were slanders that were disseminated about them. For instance, wild rumors about Christians being involved in sexual orgies and cannibalism in their meetings. How could that arise?
Thinking the body of Christ? Yeah.
Oh yeah, body of Christ and blood. How else? Well, for instance, the charge of gross immorality stems from things like the meeting called the agape, the love feast. Hey, we're going to have a love feast. Now, if you said that today, what would a lot of people's minds go to?
Woodstock.
Okay. All right. But it's probably negative, okay? The cultural mindset would just put something else on that. But that's what the New Testament meeting apparently was called, an agape. And of course, you can see how that could easily get twisted by people who did not really understand what that was. The custom of the holy kiss. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Oh, you got these Christians, they're always smooching each other. Now, it wasn't a kiss on the lips, to be sure, but it was something that could be construed, it could be twisted to mean something awful. And brothers and sisters marrying, okay? They called each other brother and sister, and then they get married. Why? Is it some kind of incest? Well, yeah, it's just ludicrous, but if you want to make up something negative about a group that you're opposed to, you take these things and you twist them. Does that go on today? Oh, yeah.
Spin doctors.
Spin doctors, yeah, make millions of money, millions of dollars. Anything anybody says, hey, we can turn that and we can spin it. And that's exactly what they're doing. We're going to make something slanderous out of this. We'll take it out of context. We'll add this bite and this sound bite and this sound bite. And together, those sound, boy, you're a horrible person. And they all, and so, I mean, it's what goes on in politics. It's what goes on everywhere. So this is one of the things that was happening in the Roman Empire. And then cannibalism. Yeah, of course, the Lord's table was being practiced in secret, and this again was in times of persecution. You weren't just going to advertise what you were doing, and it was for believers. But then the twisting of the practice of eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus. It wasn't literal; it was a metaphor for participating in the elements that look back to the death of. The death of the Lord Jesus Christ for us, and how we were to remember that. So this secrecy, coupled with malicious slander, created unusual headaches for the usually fair-minded Roman authorities. This is illustrated by a letter written to the Emperor Trajan asking for advice about the best way to deal with the followers of Christ. So this is one Pliny, I don't know who he was. This is about AD 112, so not very long after the apostles. And he says this, I do not know just the best way to deal with the Christians, for I have never been present at one of their trials. But here he is trying Christians. Is just being a Christian enough to punish? Or must something bad actually have been done? What I have done, in the case of those who admitted they were Christians, was to order them sent to Rome, if citizens, if not, to have them killed. I was sure they deserved to be punished because they were so stubborn. So there's the mindset. There's something wrong with these people. Pliny, Shelley summarizes, says, Pliny seems to feel that Christians are guilty of something. He sure isn't sure what it is, but at least he knows that it isn't immorality or cannibalism. So, I mean, those kinds of things, there's some reason. So Romans, who were really actually known for a pretty high justice system, when it came to Christians, really violated it, and increasingly more and more. So just these slanders that were levied contributed to that whole mindset to deal with them. The third cause of Christian suffering says that they were accused of atheism. Of course, the Romans and the Greeks had tons of gods, but they had no appetite for monotheism. Monotheism is fairly rare. It's not completely lacking in the ancient world, but it is by no means well represented across the board. And they blamed Christians for insulting the gods of the state. Insulting the gods of the state. So again, by this time, the Roman Empire is waning, and people weren't taking religion as seriously as they used to, but still, it was part of their culture. So to have this upstart group, saying gods aren't gods, there's one true God, was offensive, and it just added to all the other offenses. There was little serious worship of those gods by this time, but citizens were still expected to observe the conventions of that worship as a matter of duty. And then disasters would strike if the gods were neglected. Again, the whole superstition of what's going on in the world and how we live in it and so forth. And again, in some ways, the Greeks and the Romans were really enlightened philosophically and politically and so forth. And yet when you hold on to a false religious system, that can just, turn the whole logic of everything on its head. Tertullian, in his Apology, says this: "If the Tiber floods the city, or if the Nile refuses to rise, or if the sky withholds its rain, if there's an earthquake, a famine, a pestilence, at once the cry is raised, 'Christians to the lions!'" You hear anything like that today? What are Christians blamed for today, our current popular culture? Narrow-minded. Intolerant. You got to accept every... Huh? And hateful. Why? Because you have standards and you can say this is right and this is wrong, regardless of how I feel about it. Oh, that's hateful. That's intolerant. And it's the same thing back then that was going on with the gods. Well, are there gods today in our culture? Yeah. The God of individualism, the God of the me, the God of tolerance. And Environmentalism. Yeah, and so if you don't worship at those altars, then there's something wrong with you. Does it lead to persecution? Well, there's academic persecution going on right now in serious ways. Social persecution. Can it lead to physical persecution? Eventually it will. And so, that's what happens at the end of cultures. And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing. Oh, yeah.
They're being intolerant of us and our beliefs.
Well, see, they redefine everything. They redefine intolerance as hateful, spiteful repudiation. No, all it means is I'll allow that. I don't agree with it. I'll love the person. No, you can't love somebody that you don't agree with everything they say. That's hatred. That's not hatred, but they define it. So they redefine all the words. Redefine the terms, and then they can stand it on their head and make it the opposite of what it really is. Yeah, and that's exactly what we see it in so many ways in our own culture. Well, that was what was going on in the Roman culture when the church was just born and in its infancy. Any other thoughts on that? It really does ring modern, doesn't it? Yeah. Now the fourth one was the tradition of emperor worship. And this is the supreme cause of Roman persecution. And it wasn't as excessive at the beginning of the church, but by the end of the 3rd century, it was getting very, very serious. And the roots of this practice lie in the merits of Roman rule. When Rome came into being in its early days, it conquered peoples. The peoples that were conquered were almost, if not in every case, better off under Roman rule than they were under where they're being ruled by at the time. And so, for instance, when the Roman government came in and replaced a local government, which had just been, totalitarian and vicious, it tended to be characterized by impartial justice. They had law, and you had to go to trial and so forth. Now, they're going to violate that when it comes to Christians, but there's some other reasons for it. Not the fact that they were not law-abiding citizens. It was something else. So generally, there was a positive benefit by coming under the rule of imperial Rome. Roman administration resulted in safe roads and safe seas and the security of the Pax Romana. So you move around in the Roman Empire and there were robbers and so forth, but basically there was kind of a culture and an atmosphere which was positive as a result of Rome. So what developed out of that was this idea of a deep and heartfelt gratitude to the spirit of Rome. So the spirit of Rome, here's a government who will rule by law, and will have a peace, and there'll be an orderly society. We'll apprehend criminals, and we'll deal with criminals, and we'll tax you, but we'll let you live in a relative peace and in some kind of a prosperity. So the idea developed, well, people ought to be grateful for that spirit of Rome, which allows them to live in this positive environment. Well, the spirit of Rome became the goddess Roma. So they actually created a god, or goddess, Roma, who would embody this. Now, how do you show appreciation to Roma? You go offer sacrifice, you offer incense, burn incense. And so it became part of their religious system. And the spirit of Rome and the goddess of Roman then came to be seen as somehow incarnated in the emperor. Now, the first emperors, when this came about, were not all that comfortable with being, a god. But, it changed, and it just kind of, took off on its own. So what we have now is that the emperor embodies the spirit of Rome. And so if you want to show your appreciation for Rome, what do? You show your appreciation for the emperor. And how does that happen? Well, here's what happened. Reverence for the emperor as the embodiment of the spirit of Rome became heightened by the increasing problem of unification of the empire. By this time, the Roman Empire is starting to come undone. And so, people are starting in rebellions and so forth. How do you pull this thing together? That's what's going on in our country, isn't it? Every other word politically is unification. Unification. Who's unifying? I mean, everything is just being pulled apart. Is there, what is there that can unify? Well, you see a lot of policies and so forth. They're seeking to unify. It's, but that's alone not going to do it. So that's what was going on. A common religion is the greatest of unifying forces. So what would the common religion be today by those who think religion should unify? Christianity? What? Secularism? Huh? Science. Yeah. And that's being pushed. In fact, it's just interesting how Satan is working in all of these situations. Let's give people something false to unify around for the sake of unity. Unity isn't the biggest issue, it's truth. Okay? Truth will unify, but everybody's got their own truth. That's not unifying. So Caesar worship became the keystone of imperial policy, and emboldened by this idea of holding everything together. So it was deliberately organized in every province in the empire. Everywhere temples to the godhead of the emperor appeared. And what did you have to do? People came to believe that any conflicting allegiance would lead to the disintegration of order, but they were made universal and compulsory for every race and nation except the Jews. Okay? They've still got a pass, but they're over there not bothering anybody. They're not tearing the empire apart. And so this is how it started. And so the Caesar worship is what the result of it is, which required a yearly visit to a temple of Caesar, where incense was burned, and the subject was required to say, "Caesar is Lord." That's a simple thing. And Christians were being forced to do that. Some Christians did. That's going to create a problem later on, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the whole thing of membership in the church and whatnot during the end of this time. But that's what they faced in. Okay, here's your date. You go to the temple, you burn incense, and you say, "Caesar is Lord." Now you can do it, not mean it, but it was a public profession. And that's where Christians got into trouble. It was a test of political loyalty, whether or not a man was a good citizen. And refusal branded one as a traitor and as a revolutionary. So that's the crux. And this is why by the end of this early period, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, that you find such rampant persecution, is because the Roman Empire was coming apart. And this was a last-ditch effort to try and keep it unified around the emperor and around worship of the empire. Shelley summarizes it this way. He says, thus Christian worship and Caesar worship met head-on. The one thing that no Christian would ever say was, Caesar is Lord. For the Christian, Jesus Christ and He alone was Lord. To the Roman, the Christian seemed utterly intolerant and insanely stubborn. Worse, he was a self-confessed, disloyal citizen. I testify, I witness to Christ as the one Lord, and that makes me a rebel. Had the Christians been willing to burn the pinch of incense and to say formally Caesar is Lord, they could have gone on worshiping Christ to their heart's content, as far as the Romans were concerned. But the Christians would not compromise. That is why Rome regarded them as a band of potential revolutionaries, threatening the very existence of the empire. So that was the supreme cause of persecution. And it got worse as its opening centuries went on. This came to my mind this morning as I was waking up, sometime between 4 and 5, I don't know. My mind starts running. Is Francis Schaeffer in How Should We Then Live? How many of you are old enough to have seen this or looked at this material way back in 1970 something? I think it was published. And I used this the years I was teaching a worldview at Emmaus. But he has just one of the greatest chapters summarizing ancient Rome at the beginning of the book. And he talks about the flow of history and culture, and that people are unique in their inner life, and what they are in their thought world determines how they act. He talks about the presuppositions upon which not just a person's life, but a whole culture are founded. And it forms the basis for how culture is going to proceed. And he talks about the culture and freedoms of people, how they're fragile, and that without a sufficient base, when such pressures come, only time is needed, and not an often great deal of time before they collapse. Rome was not built upon a solid foundation, and that's why it fell. And he illustrates, you remember the little humpback bridge you find in streams and so forth throughout the ancient Roman Empire. And, soldiers marched over these bridges, and people have driven carts, and they're still standing, 2,000 years. But he says if you drove a modern 6-wheel truck over it, it would collapse. It would utterly collapse. And he says that's what all cultures are that are not based upon a solid foundation, that it can withstand the pressures to a certain point. But when the pressures get too great for the base, then it collapses. And that was what was happening to the Roman Empire during this period of the birth of the church, is it was collapsing, and the church was suffering for it. But the church was going to survive, and Rome was going to die. And so he talks about this being behind the reason that Christians were killed. It was because they were rebels. And I want to just end with two statements of this from Schaeffer's book. He says, we may express the nature of their rebellion, that is Christians, in two ways, both of which are true. First, we can say they worshiped Jesus as God, and they worshiped the infinite, personal God only. The Caesars would not tolerate this worshiping of the one God only. It was counted as treason. Thus, their worship became a special threat to the unity of the state during the 3rd century and during the reign of Diocletian, when people of the higher classes began to become Christians in larger numbers. If they had worshipped Jesus and Caesar, they would have gone unharmed. But they rejected all forms of syncretism, that is, bringing together from everywhere to kind of make something out of nothing. They worshiped the God who had revealed himself in the Old Testament through Christ and in the New Testament, which had gradually been written, and they worshiped him as the only God. They allowed no mixture. All other gods were seen as false gods. So that was the first reason, or the first aspect of their rebellion. And then he says, We can also express in a second way why the Christians were killed. No totalitarian authority nor authoritarian state can tolerate those who have an absolute by which to judge that state and its actions. The Christian had that absolute in God's revelation. Because the Christian had an absolute, universal standard by which to judge not only personal morals but the state, they were counted as enemies of totalitarian Rome and were thrown to the beasts. And that just sums it all up. And every culture goes through this. And it's just that the Christians had a foundation. They had a foundation that was true, and it was true by revelation. And that's why next week we want to at least begin looking at the whole aspect of the Scriptures and how we see the evidence of the fact that the early church was based squarely on the Scriptures. And the people leading these churches, that was their authority. That was what they were. That's what they were based on. So Rome fell because it had inadequate base. The church can't fail because its foundation is the Lord Jesus Christ and the revelation that God has given, that has been written down in the Scriptures. And so those are the guarantors that the church was going to survive as long as God was pleased to leave it on earth.